Hello and welcome to another episode of Political Agenda brought to you by New Narrative with me, your host PJ Thum. I'm wearing a blue and white batik shirt sitting in front of a big white curtain and my pronouns are he, him. Today we have two founding members of the Peer Support and Advocacy Group for Queer Muslims, QASA, with us to talk about their organization. But before we get into that, this podcast is brought to you by New Narrative, a movement for democracy in Southeast Asia. Please do support us by joining as a member at newnarrative.com/join or donating at newnarrative.com/donate. Okay, so QASA is a peer support group for queer Muslims. We have two founding members, Irie and Mohammed, who are here with us today. Irie, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Irie and I am a community organizer. My pronouns are they, them, and I am wearing a dark green kabaya.
Hello, my name is Muhammad and I'm the religious advisor for QASA. I'm wearing a white shirt, but I'm not present in the camera.
Yes, so for those of you watching on YouTube, you'll notice you can only see two of us, Irie and myself. Mohammed is off camera and has asked to remain anonymous. So, Mohammed, would you like to talk about why you've chosen to be anonymous today?
It's more to protect my family rather than myself. I came from the religious industry and my whole family is in the religious industry. And I hope this also highlights the extent to which, the lack of queer rights in Singapore has an effect on real world harm or real world effect, for people like us.
Can I just ask, what kind of backlash would they get if the community learned that one of their family members was queer? Would it be they would be shunned or worse?
Yeah, it could be worse. It has gone to the point of physical threats and violent threat online. So that's one of the main reasons why I'm choosing to remain anonymous. But if it's not a physical threat, then it's a threat to one's livelihood, because as I've mentioned, my family is in the religious industry, so their bread and butter from the religious industry. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. And thank you for, both of you, for your courage for coming on this, knowing that the consequences can be very severe. But I really appreciate you coming on Political Agenda. So let's get straight into what is QASA. Irie, would you like to tell us what is QASA and what do you do?
So QASA, as mentioned, is a peer support and advocacy collective, and what we really want to do is create a safe space where queer Muslims feel comfortable exploring both spirituality and sexuality, because what we realized was that there are just no queer spaces in which people feel comfortable, exploring, I might be a bit more spiritual or religious. I want to pursue a different lifestyle that isn't just clubs. And that's not really available. There's no information there. But if queer people do decide this is the path that they want to take, they can't exactly turn up at your nearest masjid, It's not a very queer-friendly space. In many places, it's violent. And so we wanted to be that kind of middle ground where we see you as you are. You don't have to be a perfect Muslim. I'm definitely not. But we welcome you and all your struggles, and we understand where you've been, and we want to build that safety for you, build that community.
To add to Irie's answer, it's also in the name, QASA. We changed K to Q. So QASA in Malay means power. And we realized that majority of the, especially minority Muslim support groups, catered around healing or catered around trauma-based support groups. Whereas for us, we wanted to also focus on post-reconciliation within your sexual identity and your religious identity, and also create not just a safe space, but an empowering space for people to express their religious identity as well. And we realized there isn't a space for that, because it's always been focused about your sexual identity or your gender identity. We want to provide a platform where you can discuss about how to identify yourself as a queer and Muslim, or as a Muslim who just happens to be queer, which also is also a holistic approach. So we have a mental health branch of the organization as well. Yeah.
So how big is your organization right now?
So the founding members of QASA, there are about 6 of us.
Right.
And then what we actually planned to do right before the pandemic cut in was to start different chapters. So, I think specifically when we look at young queer people who have no idea how to navigate any of this, whether it's their queerness or their religious, relationship with religion, we wanted to be able to kind of guide them through that. And we wanted to start chapters where, you would get an introduction and orientation within the community, people you could feel safe with, and then also give them kind of the 101 on mental health, on spiritual health, on just so many different things that come with being queer that no one guides you on, and you often have to find out by yourself, and it's often a very painful process when you do it alone.
So whenever we organize an event, it ranges in the tens. We don't have like a registration of members because our main focus is peer support. So our day-to-day operations is really responding to DMs on Instagram, to queries and, just a peer chat, because it's nice to have someone who can relate to you. It's not easy to find friends who happens to be queer within the Muslim community, let alone one that is open to talk about it. So we wanted to provide like a friend, like a queer Muslim friend that you can talk to, who just happens to know a little bit more about reconciling between the religion and one's sexuality, and can provide you with resources, whether it's religious resources, academic resources, or even mental health resources, or even support in other forms. So that's why we partner with, not really partner, but we are in constant communication with Uga Chaga and Pink Dot. When we are unable to provide resources or support, then we would channel them to the right, people or partners that are working on the ground.
Because of the pandemic, essentially our plan to host these chapters, with that couldn't happen, and so we've been focusing on the last 2 years on creating these resources, as we talked about, mainly because to begin with, that visibility isn't present. People aren't aware that you can be both these things at once, and beyond creating that awareness, I think it's also creating that trust within the community, because there's just so much violence on both sides that you never really know who you can turn to, and so that peer support function is very important. But again, we recognize that we are not qualified or trained therapists, and so we have to be mindful that as much as we want to support you, there are limits to what we can do for you.
Yeah, that was going to be my next question about trust, because, Mohammed, you're not even willing to come on, for very good reason, of course, to be seen. So how do you create trust in these environments where you have random people reaching out to you through your DM saying, I need advice or help? How do you then ensure the safety of the people who are already on the inside and filter and ensure that it's not, someone just trying to investigate or find out who you are or break that trust?
That's always a constant challenge. Whenever we try to organize an event, we always feel the need to filter, because we do face trolls on a daily basis and people wanting to sabotage our causes, no matter how noble they are. So what we try to do is have a filter of who would be able to attend any of our events, whether online or offline. And then with regards to establishing trust amongst our own community, we are more of like, we don't just subscribe to one agenda or one narrative. We provide several narratives that you can choose. There's no one Islam in our opinion. You can choose to express your religious identity to however you wish, but we can help you provide with resources for you to base that identity or base that expression upon. So like, we don't want to be the editor for this identity, because the point is to provide a platform, not just one narrative.
So recently we actually hosted a Kwa Supper. The moment the restrictions lifted, we were like, okay, we have to do something. And so for the very first time, we had a supper with 10 people that and we had vetted every single one of these people. That meant actually, meeting with them up in person before, just to see, like what the vibes are, and to make sure that they don't mean any harm. And so we invited 10 of these queer Muslims over to my place, and again, because it's a place of, it's very unsafe if we don't vet.
It's your own home. Right?
Yeah. And what we what we are very big on is also that idea of like facilitation. You don't just throw people together and expect them to form that bond. And
I see.
yeah, so that trust has to be slowly created. So group work, and one of our founding members is a social worker. So
Okay.
we relied on them to use group work processes to really build that bond of trust, that idea of communication, and because that was only our first one, we want to eventually go deeper and talk about other stuff. But yeah, that was good.
We've gotten also better at filtering trolls,
Mhm.
especially for our online events. So we would include a Telegram link, for example, and then we will be doing like a sort of interview of who will be joining. So for our recent Quran class, we did a filtering process. So we've gotten quite a good SOP in terms of our online, organizing. So we can better manage, who will be attending our events, and also those participating also want to feel that they can feel safe being in our online events, so they won't feel that someone is spying on them.
Mhm.
So we do have to put up an SOP of filtering trolls and people who just are bad actors. Yeah.
And Mohammed, can I pick up on one thing you said, which I think is a question a lot of people listening, especially non-Muslims
Mm.
listening, will have, which is the compatibility of Islam
Mm.
and being queer, right? I guess the obvious question is like, can you be queer and Muslim? And you're saying that there are multiple ways to understand or multiple identities?
No, the
paths?
answer to that
Okay.
is there are.
Yeah.
It's not about can you. There are.
Okay.
Whenever people say could you be, what the answer is mute. The question is mute. There are.
Mm-hmm.
So now move on to the next question, because it's how. That's
How.
what we're trying to focus on.
Right.
How are you going to be a queer and Muslim at the same time? If you look back in history, Muslims in the past, well, arguably they don't really, have the same conception of homosexuality as we do. They've already managed to do so. Same-sexness is not a new thing in humanity, right?
Mm-hmm.
What is new is just, the modern period with laws and etc. But now, we haven't had a space to ask or to question the how, which is where Kwasa is trying to come in. Because every time you come into that picture, then it's all going back to the Quran and the Hadith and the religion, or whether is possible or not. But that question is really mute, because there already are queer Muslims on the
Mm.
ground, and yeah, you're not providing a platform for them to like better express themselves, holistically. Yeah.
So the question of how then, when
Mm.
people ask, and what do you can you summarize a response?
So, I mean, as usual, you have the moderate Muslims, conservative Muslims, and you also have progressive Muslims, right? That's
Yeah.
sort of pretty much the I want to say spectrum, but you could say spectrum. So you could argue that it is a test. You could argue that it is a sin. You could argue anyways, right? At the end of the day, what does your conscience tell you? And that's where we want to help you facilitate, that expression of your
Mhm.
sexuality and your religious identity, right? So if you say that it is a test, so let's have a harmonious view of it then, so you don't, doesn't lead you to like self-hatred and like other mental health issues, right? If you see that this is something that is, possible in Islam, and you could also argue that, no matter how the conservative Muslim wants to argue that, I mean, homoeroticism was really a part of like Islamic poetry and literature for centuries, right? You could also argue that, and we are here to tell you, okay, so how are you going to conceptualize that in this modern period, right? And then then you're gonna have to talk about family, you have to talk about relationship, you have to talk about love, you have to talk about bearing children. But the point is, we haven't gone past the reconciliation part, because
Mhm.
we are still there.
Mm.
But the thing is, people are still continuing living. Life continues. Meaning are still being made right now. So where's the help and support for that? And where's the platform or safe space to discuss that? Yeah.
And I think, to that point, what we see a lot of is that there's so much hypocrisy in the Islamic community. There is so much, there's so much that's unaddressed within, let's say, the Muslim community in Singapore. There's a lot of, sexual assault. There is a lot of religious abuse. There's a lot of there's just so much that's going on, and like even when you think about poverty and homelessness and all of that, our religious institutions are not actually really focusing on those issues, and yet they want to talk about queerness as sin. They want to talk about all of these things that just don't tally. It doesn't make sense. Like, why is this the issue when you know very well that your own children are also being a bad Muslim on other terms? They're just not queer. So why is that the struggle? And as much as and I think for a lot of founding members, we are not perfect Muslims either. We have that struggle, we have that questioning, but we felt that it was very, very important that you get to come as you are, and that you get to reconcile on your own terms, whether or not you choose to say that you are Muslim, because it's the journey. It is that journey of finding out, and there's just no grace and gentleness that we see elsewhere.
To add to that, people have this conception that queer Muslim groups or rather queer groups is always talking about sex. It is always about sex.
Right, yeah.
I find it very interesting because I've attended quite a number of queer Muslim groups all over the world, and it's always about meaning. It's always about religion. It's always about finding love, or it's always about one's relationship with God. Do you get what I mean?
Yes.
It's really no one really talks about sex in these meetings. So that was when we realized that we needed to create a platform to talk about that part. To talk about empowerment, to talk about the post-reconciliation, because we already are, And the thing to add to Iris' point is because we are a scarecrow, argument, right? Oh, look, we're sort of like a measure, straw man. We are like, oh, look, this is the measure of like one's nation's faith. For example, in Egypt, when Muslim Brotherhood came to power, right? The first group of minorities that they targeted were the LGBTQ Muslims, right? To showcase, that they are the authority on the religious authority, that they are sort of savior of the religion. So it's happening everywhere. Minorities are always the target of, political targets, for political expedience. So that's what's happening when I say about backlash, right? It's always a showcase of, okay, this is why we are targeting them, because it showcases that we are protecting the religion.
And we're superior.
Yeah, that we are superior. But then there are also other issues within the mainstream community that is also a threat to the religion as a theology, but it's not being as addressed or not as visible. You get what I mean?
Yeah.
It's just an easy target. LGBTQ minorities are just an easy target. Yeah.
What do you think that is? I mean, I have my suspicions, but I'm interested in what you'd have to say. Where, why is it LGBTQ Muslims are the target when it's so hard to you look at someone, you can't tell whether they're LGBTQ. There's no way to know, and it's such an inconsequential thing. What difference does it make whether you're LGBTQ or not? Right? Why isn't the dividing line for trying to prove you're a good Muslim being more something like, how much have you donated to charity? How much have you fed the poor? How much have you helped those who can't help themselves? Why is it just because it's easy to target such a small invisible minority
and less noisy minority? It's
noisy.
A smaller number.
Right.
I mean, I'm here not wanting to go on camera trying to talk about queer rights in Islam. Who in their right mind would want to go all out being a public advocate for queer Muslims and not being afraid? So sorry, Irie. But like, you get what I mean? Also, not a lot of us are privileged, do not come from privileged background, and privilege comes in many factors, come from different factors. So there's so many different reasons why we are an easy target, and why we are always the straw man for anything.
The history of queer Muslims, I mean, it's a very rich history. It's not like you've just suddenly appeared out of nowhere, right?
I mean, there's a lot to unpack there. Whether, first of all, the Muslims in the past really actually do identify themselves as queer Muslims, as queer. What does queer even mean? Considering that it was a different epistemology of gender, on gender ontology, could we even argue that they actually were, queer, right?
Right.
Or were they simply viewing everything as their right to love whomever, right? But the point is that there's something there. There's a reference there. There's a heritage there. However you would like to view it, whatever lens that you would like to view it from, and that heritage is not being tapped on by current queer identifying Muslims as they formulate or as they conceptualize their identities right now, because it's just not being shared. And there's no participation from the mainstream Muslim scholars to help or aid in that identification process or that reconciliation process. I'm sure you know there's a lot of censorship happening, in general, right? Especially in the Islamic religious industry, when it comes to manuscripts and when it comes to our religious heritage. You have what's supposed to be normative Islam versus possible Islam, or different narratives of Islam in the past. And a lot of it right now, when you say mainstream Muslim, is what mainstream Muslim would like Islam to be, or how it should be, right? And then they would bring the argument about ISIS and terrorists. But there's a difference though. ISIS wants to destroy people, whereas queer Muslims wants to love, just want the freedom to love whoever they want. You can't use that argument that, we need to preserve the religion to prevent it from being corrupted,
But
by
even
people
in the
like
mainstream,
ISIS.
there are different debates, right? Because
Exactly.
isn't it, they aren't even religious debates; they're cultural debates.
Mm.
Like, if I remember correctly, Jokowi was asserting that there was a Nusantara Islam,
Mm-hmm.
whereas Malaysian leaders were saying no, like all Islam is the same around the world, and we need to, we should all conform to the same Islam. So even there's a debate: can Islam be culturally, adapt itself to different cultural contexts?
But when you're a queer Muslim, you're not even invited to the debate table.
Right. Yeah.
You don't want to identify yourself at the table that you are. So what we're trying to do at Kwasa is to provide a platform where you can discuss about it, how you want to formulate it, and then we can help you with resources so you can feel more assured. Because no one has actually reached certitude when it comes to religious conception, have they? Can the mainstream Muslim community actually say, this is absolutely right, I'm definitely going to heaven because of what I'm doing right now? Can you absolutely say that? No one can, right? And ultimately, you rest within the mainstream community or the majority, or because majority of people are doing it, I'm assured that I am on the right path. That's what we want to provide to the queer Muslims, to give them some level of assurance that you don't have to feel a certain way because of how you're born and these are the resources for you to feel a little bit more assured. And ultimately, we are all in this together. We're just trying our best to be Muslim. I think in the Quran it says, be pious or be righteous to God to the best of your capabilities. And that's literally what queer Muslims want to do. People like to talk about queerness or homosexuality as being a choice, right? The nature versus nurture debate. But then people forgot that being Muslim is a choice, and we chose to remain Muslims no matter what, and that should be lauded. We feel like Kwasa, that should be celebrated, and I think in Islam that is celebrated. Despite whatever, you're still remaining faithful to the religion, and that's something that we feel disappointed at times by the mainstream Muslim community, because they're not recognizing that. When they see us, they only see us as sexual subjects or sexual objects. You over-sexualize us.
Yeah.
You over-sexualize us, and all your focus is always about sex, when we are trying to tell you that what we want to talk to you about or what we want to discuss with you about is meaning and living.
And I think there's this I think queer people do this very well. We always kind of challenge the norm. We want to rewrite our own stories. We want to make that meaning. The way that queer people do, the way queer people interpret and understand families of choice, marriages and relationships and belonging, that's just how, we kind of evolve, our own stories. We want to make that meaning. The way that queer people do, the way queer people interpret and understand families of choice, marriages and relationships and belonging, that's just how, we kind of evolve, our own stories. We want to make that meaning. The way that queer people interpret and understand families of choice, marriages and relationships and belonging, that's our relationship to society and want to make it better, not just for ourselves but for other people. And in the same way, we want to do that with Islam. We choose to believe in an Islam that is much more accepting and graceful than the majority would have you believe, and to, you know, really kind of guide people again into that heritage that you're not alone. You have your queer elders. We're not queer elders, but you know, there are queer elders. There are communities. There are people who have made this possible, and you don't have to go through the same kind of like hardship we did, where we were trying to make this meaning alone, and when cut off from the world, you know, no resources, nothing nothing to back us. We want to make that path just easier.
Yeah, what you describe just sounds so, in some ways, mundane, right? Everyone wants meaning. Everyone's searching for meaning, for community, and what you want is no different, right? You want to have lives of dignity and respect, and that is no different from anyone else. And this whole obsession with sex, I have to wonder whether it's also about policing bodies, policing, lives. And part of the problem then is we live in a country where the government asserts the right to police our private lives. So I'm curious a bit about the interaction between how queer Muslims are treated and then the broader social, cultural, political context in Singapore. Do you see that very much reinforcing each other, and how the government treats your community, you know, both as in this acceptance that there is something distinctive about your community, but also trying to then impose a certain uniformity on it. All this policing, it feels like this has become almost over the years it's become very acceptable in Singapore for authority to police people, to police how you live, how you act, how you think, in pursuit of certain narratives, right? For the government, it's nation building, it's like economic progress. But then for internally within the communities, that's become then acceptable to, create social cohesion, to clarify our identity, to be, to create a distinctive community, to have a community that supports each other. And then it becomes a debate about what really is development. What is it all of us being exactly the same and imposing something on a community so that we have unity and we're all moving in the same direction? Or is it respecting every individual person within the community and having them earn like self-determination and agency, right? And then you end up with the same debate that what happens if another person or another group's self-determination conflicts with my definition of self-determination, and how do we resolve that? And historically in Singapore, the answer through the PAP has been to impose something on everyone, and it sounds like the same thing that's happening here. So, yeah, I don't think I have a question there. It's just an observation where we keep running into these issues in Singapore because we're not able to talk about issues because everything's imposed. Every issue about identity ends up running into the same problem where stuff's being imposed on you by elites in pursuit of a broader goal. So I guess a question from this is, are there queer Muslim groups across the border? Because we live next to the biggest Muslim country in the world, right? How is it dealt with over there?
I think to respond to your observation is that people don't realize that we are part of the uniformity, right? Queer people are contributing to the economy, are business owners, major stakeholders in this part of the nation building. The problem arises when visibility is involved.
Right.
When you become too visible. And then the problem arises when equality is being brought to the table. When you demand for equality, I wouldn't say more equality because it's definitely unequal right now. So that's the problem. But otherwise, if you kowtow to the day-to-day quotidian affairs of economy contributions, by all means go do you. But then when you want to ask for more, then that's a problem. I always wonder, like, why are we always asking the mainstream Muslim community about what is fair for the minority within the mainstream Muslim community? You don't ask a majority about what should be fair for the minority. There's just bonkers there. I don't understand how is that. Like, why do we have to look to them to ask for what should be done to the minority? You should be talking to the minority to ask them how they should be fairly treated. What are they looking for? So the problem is always about visibility. If you're in the underground, if you keep to yourself, don't come out, don't be visibly queer, everyone is fine with that. Like you said, no one is inconsequential when one is LGBT Muslims, because no one actually knows unless you're visibly queer. But then when your visibility is involved, then everything will go to haywire, and then people will be panicking, right? With regards to like our border our neighbors, it's always funny how, for example, in Malaysia, queer identifying individuals are main part of the entertainment industry, and you can see how visibly queer they are. But then when they start to come out or become, or rather express that they are queer, then that becomes a problem. Then religion is involved, etc. I think there was recently a trans influencer who everyone knows that she's trans identifying, right? She has gone through surgeries, etc. Everyone loves her. She has a huge following on Instagram. She's viral, etc. But then it became an issue, and then the mainstream Muslim community, and then it became politicized when she went for pilgrimage and performed pilgrimage as a woman. Then that becomes an issue, and then everyone start to talk about it, and like, this is problematic, etc. But you were okay with her doing her thing, but when she decides to become religious, because that is part of her identity, then it becomes an issue and politicized, and something must be done about it. But
like this gatekeeping of Islam is at its core just so paradoxical, because people are trying to go towards their religion, and what all you're doing is really just pushing people away. And we see that happen within so many families where you want people to be more religious, more practicing, but you enact so many different forms of abuse and control and expect people to be interested or to feel that closeness or alignment. And to your point about what we do with our neighbors, we haven't planned anything yet, but we do actually get quite a few DMs from people from Malaysia and Indonesia, because they're also similarly so shocked that something could exist. And I do think that it is more common perhaps in different regions, because we had someone from London, I think, attend our Kuasapa, and they were saying that like, here you just can't find queer Muslim communities, but back home it's so common, and it's so easy to come as you are and feel at home and understand that we are all going to look very different to one another, and yet we can still respect our the different ways to practice religion. Some people are wearing hijab, some people aren't, some people are tahajjud, some people aren't, like just very these deviant expressions of identity. Ultimately that doesn't matter, because we understand that you respect the person, and whether or not you choose to bring Islam into it is a reflection of you and not the other person.
Also, Indonesia and Malaysia are bigger in number. Their religious expressions are more variegated, more diverse. Islam in Indonesia is very rich, right? And it's spread across geographies basically. So there's more opportunities there, for you to form safer communities in certain locales. Malaysia is a slightly different picture, because the religious authority there is more centralized. rather than Indonesia. Indonesia's religious authority, even when you have the Nahdlatul Ulama, it's not really that centralized because it's such a huge geography. So you have pockets of communities, operating within their own religious landscapes, so to say. Whereas Malaysia, it's very centralized. There's a whole, legal operations when it comes to religion. It's a bit harder for, queer identifying, Malay Muslims in Malaysia. And we get that sometimes in our DMs as well, people reaching out to us from across the border saying that thank you so much for this, because like we said that Kuasa really focus more on the post-reconciliation rather than just about healing and trauma, etc. So they were very happy to see that we are providing narratives or counter narratives, correcting misconceptions, providing like religious lessons, providing community, which may be difficult in their locales.
I think like having that kind of collaboration would be really wonderful, but just because safety is such a big issue in both Malaysia and Indonesia, maybe in Indonesia it's a bit more flexible, but I struggle to think about how we can build that collaboration and build that partnership when here we are already so limited.
If I can pick up on something you said, Mohammed, about how Malaysia is very centralized and Indonesia more decentralized, the countries are also governed that way. And it just, to come back to this point, how much of the oppression that you feel is because you're also yourselves part of a minority. So you're a minority within the minority, and the minority is desperately trying to hold on to. You already feel you're so oppressed, and part of it, do you get a sense that you're feeling that other people in your community, the people who are oppressing you in your community, feel that you're the ones letting the group down by not conforming and building internal strength and unity, which is part of the big problem of how we deal with minority majority relationships in Singapore, that it's a very sort of top down oppressive, fit into neat boxes sort of approach. It's like just free society and there's no evolution, but there's also no recognition of the individual within that. But also a problem where everyone thinks of themselves as a minority, right? And historically in Singapore, you have a very interesting dynamic where under British colonialism, the Chinese were heavily oppressed. Their language, their education system, their culture, and then the PAP continued that, shutting down Nanta and ending Chinese education. So I brought this up in a previous podcast with Maisara about how on earth to deal with a problem of race when both sides see themselves as the oppressed minority. And how on earth do you build solidarity or overcome things when, because of all these decades of oppression, both sides conclude that, we're the ones who've been oppressed, why should we give way? So coming back to you, do you get a feeling in your community that, hey, we're already so oppressed, stop making things worse for us? We're already so struggling so much, why do you need to be different? Why can't you just, conform and be a good team player until, I don't know, some unspecified future, right? But do you get that sense as well, that, the feeling towards you is not like, we don't like you, but you're letting us down?
I'll let you answer.
So you asked how. It's easy. One word: empathy. I think the mainstream Muslim community forget, because they tend to make us into cardboard pieces of just sex, that they devoid us of humanity and common problems and commonalities. We face Islamophobia, we face racism, sexism, and all the same things that other minorities like Muslims also face. But they forget that, people think that, they have Pink Dot, they have a community. That's not true. That's rampant racism within the queer community in Singapore. There's Singapore beauty standards to adhere to, which minorities do not match,
Right.
and you talk about behaving oneself. It's not that we do not want to behave ourselves, but how do we behave ourselves and still be able to live with ourselves, right? Sure, it is easy to just get married, to an opposite sex, for example, and live your life. But what does that say about you, as a religious person? How is that fair to the opposite, to your spouse, for example? If you're really all about gender equality right now, right? How is that fair to the opposite gender, for example? Say like a gay man, Muslim man marry a straight, Muslim woman. Sure, sex is not everything, but how is that fair to that woman? How is that ethical? How is that Islamic? When there's lack of honesty there, how can that be part of the religion? When there's no integrity there, that's no longer religion then. There's nothing about that is faith anymore. So that's what we're trying to do. How do we live ethically and behave ourselves, but to the best of our capabilities within our moral codes, within the Islamic moral codes as well. But we are not getting support, because there's no conversation happening. Whenever there's a conversation happening with the mainstream Muslim community, and there has been, with some of the religious authorities here, the conversation is all about like, okay, this is our stand, and then that's it, and then you stop there. Do you get what I mean?
Yeah.
And then you tell us what are your problems, but what's the next step then? Do you get what I mean?
Yeah.
And then it will be followed by a media release about, oh, we've done this, we've reached out, we have a focus group discussion. Yeah, but focus group discussion, you don't come up with a solution. There isn't really a next step. You get what I mean?
Yeah.
And you already come to the table not with really open arms, more of like, this is our stand, and you just have to accept it because this is the majority anyway, and behave yourself. We do want to behave ourselves. Trust us, it would just be easier if we could behave ourselves, but then we wouldn't be able to live with ourselves. And that's the problem that we want to talk about. That's why we have a mental health branch as well. You get what I mean? It's say if you choose a certain lifestyle. I think for queer Muslims, the lifestyle is still a choice, because we have to make that choice, because it's a momentous choice. You get what I mean? Yeah.
I think with the behaving as a team player, that's a very interesting question, because sometimes it feels almost generational. Like there are certain generations of Muslims that will enforce that a bit more stricter than others. And with some generations, it's not even that you have to be a team player, but there's just no value to being queer. They just don't see the point. Like why deviate? Why not? And the question doesn't come, why can't you just do what everyone else is doing? But it then just is something that is very, it's a sort of privilege. It's like that comfort of like knowing like, okay, this is what I can control, and this is what community looks like. And if you deviate, then I have to question what identity is. I have to question what faith is. I have to recognize that actually my exploration of faith isn't very deep, because it's not very understanding. And that's just what I've personally experienced. It's really not about being a team player. It's just, it would be uncomfortable for me to do that radical self-inquiry. Yeah.
And when we say deviate and mainstream, we always have to remember it's elites, people in power setting up this idea of what is mainstream. If you look at culture in Singapore and how it's changed so drastically over the decades, and what is mainstream, what is normal, has changed so much, right? The things that we do or think or say today would be very alien to our grandparents 50 years ago. And I can say this because I've really studied the 50s and 60s, and the kind of ideas, the thoughts, the assumptions people had back then, not just in Singapore, globally, are in many ways drastically different from what we have today. Sometimes for the better, but sometimes for the worse. And another observation I actually want to make is this idea that, we've consulted, we've had the focus group discussion, and that's all. And that's actually also a very PAP thing, which I pointed out that for PAP, democracy is having the act of consultation, without necessarily having any action on that consultation, right? So they will invite people for talks and reach out, and then they will go away and make the decision. And most of the time, that's the decision they were going to make anyway. But they'll say, oh, well, we consulted you, therefore this is a consultative process. You have been, your democratic rights have been respected. That this decision-making process is democratic, right? You don't actually get to sit in the meeting where the decision is made, right, or have any impact on the implementation of anything. You just get consulted. And so again, it feels like, to come back to a theme that I feel is emerging. It's not just queer Muslims, but it's like the way Singapore is governed as a whole is so hierarchical and top down, and the way the PAP has set up certain assumptions has also filtered downwards into how individual communities try to self-govern.
And talking about like self-governing, we've been quite abstract in this, but there are real world harm happening as we speak. There isn't a week that goes by that we do not receive DMs saying about I'm being abused domestically, right? Or I'm thinking of like self-harming, self-harm, etc. And these all require help from the mainstream community, right? Because a lot of it has been religiously fueled, right? Some of these domestic abuse are religiously fueled. Parents, siblings, or relatives find it justified to do so, to physically abuse a queer Muslim, because for some strange reason they believe that the religion allows them to do so. And when there's lack of support or lack of counter narrative from religious authorities or the mainstream Muslim community, the problem just persists. So it's a nice thing that you could check it off your list that you've done an FGD, but the problem is still there, and it's been there, and no one's doing anything about it. And frankly speaking, like queer Muslims groups in Singapore or even like in this region are very tired of it. So that's why we have to resort to like forming our safe spaces and like come up with like housing solutions, etc. To the point where we have to create a community where you can stay at mine just to escape your abuse for the night or two. And this shouldn't be upon us, as a minority. We have our own lives to live. This is a real world problem that requires real world solutions.
The violence is very structural, very systemic, and because there's just so much that's tied up with like finances, there is just
and privilege.
There's no independence, there's no safety if you don't have your own money ultimately. And that's why we keep seeing this pattern of people just absolutely being pushed to the margins until they break. And the only way that many of those people get out is if they are able to stay employed and able to find their own place to live.
It's really about privilege, and we're just talking about this part. We haven't even talking about sexual health, right? A lot of there's an overrepresentation of HIV patients, for example, and people with like STDs amongst the Malay Muslim queer folks, because there is a lack of like sexual health and sexual information. Who is going to educate them? Your conservative Muslim parents are not going to educate you on like sexual health, but like let's be real, people are sexually active. So like you're not being practical. You're still on the idealistic, notion that you just behave. This is the ideal. Meet it. But we are not, we are not perfect human beings, and you'll never meet that ideal. So what are you going to do about it? Emptiness. There's no conversation that leads up to that, right? So, like I said, there's real world issues that require real world solutions, but there isn't a space for it. So that's why we try to facilitate this conversation, try to provide resources, try to educate, not just empower, but also educate queer Muslims by just being their friend. So that's why we are not professionals. Like maybe like we have a social worker, but we're not professionals. But the least that we could do is we are an informed friends. We might have a little bit more privilege for us to do this, because this takes privilege. It takes a lot of our time and our mental bandwidth, and sleep and personal time from family, etc. to respond to requests. And you can't respond to a query through DM while you're in a low emotional state. You have to be stable yourself. where you are still going through it yourself. You know, as a queer Muslim, we also have our own issues to deal with. We have family to deal with, right? So this should have been a systemic, you know, there should have been a systemic support. But no, because why? People still want to talk about whether it's possible to be gay and Muslim at the same time.
And
Yeah.
forget like the queer people for just 1 second, right? If you look at the issues within the Muslim community, like I mentioned earlier, there's so much like sex ed is not, you know, robust at all. There's so much to do with like abuse and violence, and like there's so much to talk about and address, but there are just no resources or no interest on really fulfilling the needs of the community as they are. So the only thing that we can do now is to decide, okay, you know what, as much as those issues are also important, we have to look within ourselves and we have to see that the queer Muslims need the most protection, and we will do everything in our power to provide that. Yeah.
Actually, we do receive requests from heterosexual identifying, you know, Muslims asking us about sexual questions and stuff relating to religion and interfaith marriages. But we have to push back and we have to say this is beyond our scope, because our focus is just for queer Muslims, to be a peer support for queer Muslims. But we find that is
There's
an
still
indication.
there's still a demand.
Yeah, there's a
right?
demand for it, and because like Irie was saying, not addressing the queer the Muslim community as they are, rather than as they should be or how they should behave. That's the problem. Then a lot of issues goes under the rug and then nothing gets addressed, or you don't want to address them because everything is still taboo, which is very interesting, because like when we were looking at our resources, we've seen how sex positive Islam was. We basically discuss about every single thing. You get what I mean? Like homoeroticism was the vogue of, you know, the medieval period, right? Like you know, back then the Europeans were the ones, you know, judging the Muslims, right? Saying these are the libertines, these are the ones who are not behaving themselves, you know, God cursed them, right? Now it's the other way around. and it's so funny how we are not able to discuss topics which were discussed back then so freely and openly in the mosque and in like open spaces. Yeah, I mean, things have changed, but we can't wait, so that's why we form Kwasa, you know, to bring back that, you know, culture of like openness and empowerment and education. Yeah.
So ultimately, you know, the space you're creating is fantastic, but what I'm also hearing is there's so much of it that is just structural and beyond just queer Muslims. It's about how Singapore is misogynistic, it's economically exploitative, you know, neoliberal capitalism is destroying us, authoritarianism is destroying us. And really what we need is to change the whole system. If everyone has rights, if we have a redistributive economy that treats people with dignity and respect, it feels like 90% of your problems will be dealt with.
Pretty much. But and that's the thing. I think we also create Kwasa because we recognize that first step is the hardest, but we have to do it. And we hope that, you know, by creating Kwasa, other queers, other Muslims, other whoever, you know, feel okay, you know, if they can do that, then we can also create our own communities and safe spaces, because that's the only form of resistance we have right now.
People always caveat their questions to us, thank you so much for existing, because it means a lot to them that we are, you know, existing, right? That we are here acting, you know, for lack of a better word, a catalyst for change, basically, and we are starting change, and we are hoping that it would cause like a snowball effect, you know. We might be limited to what we can do right now, but at least we are starting it, and that's what we aim for. Now that restrictions are lifted, we are hoping for more events, more community-based offline events where we can meet each other and have like actual discussions of like religion and etc. We're also trying to create more safe spaces for queer identifying Muslims to practice their religion, right? So like I said, there's also the issues of like some queer identifying or visibly queer Muslims not being able to practice freely in the mosque, etc., or ask certain questions in the mosque, etc. So that's what we're trying to provide, filling the gaps, right there.
Okay, so what are your future plans You've mentioned more events. You have an Instagram page. Will you have any other channels? Are you developing any other channels?
We have Twitter.
We are
Twitter.
trying.
Yeah.
Okay.
But
Yeah.
I think for us, Instagram is really where our resource library will be for now. We might look at a site, but we are really just building those resources first. Whether those are, academic texts or just like guides, manual instructions on how to perform a certain religious rite. Those are the things that we are looking at. But as mentioned, I think we are doing these things called chapters, where we want to basically welcome as many queer Muslims as we can. We vet all of them, and then we have a sort of like orientation into what being queer in Singapore means. What tools do you need, and then guiding them through the mental health, the spiritual, the community aspect, and basically what we're planning to do is groups of maybe 8 people, I think, and this one group will follow like the different chapter as it progresses, so that they have and these are like basically in-person workshops that we're conducting, and opportunities to gather together with community safely.
The goal is to have them empowered and informed about being queer and Muslims at the end of it, so that can have an effect around their social circles, because we can't reach out to that many, right? And so
equipping them with that, like with those tools, and also with their own communities, because we don't want to be at the center of it. We want you to see that, okay, there are at least 7 other people in my group, but across the community there are like maybe 5 other groups, and so I know like I don't have to always go to Kwasa directly. We're not like an authority.
Yes.
You form your own communities, and then you go branch out and you do your own like projects.
I mean, we started as friends.
We did.
Kwasa started as friends because we realized there's no friends. So we are hoping that, and it's easy to feel lonely and alone as a queer Muslims, especially in Singapore. So at least we are helping people to make friends with each other.
And okay, this might be a stupid question, but is it possible to do LGBTQ friendly religious services? Like, because in the Christian community there's at least one church which is openly very pro LGBTQ, started by the former Methodist bishop. Is the same thing possible?
It's already been done, like across the globe, in
Yeah.
Australia, in London, in the States. In Singapore, it would be very difficult.
Because of the religious authority here.
So you need licensing and things like
Exactly.
that? Right.
Yeah, you will need like the Asatizar recognition scheme, certification for you to perform any religious services. However, we do have a number of queer-friendly religious clerics, clergymen in Singapore. Recently, we had a Quran class which was facilitated by one of them. So that happens, but we do have to reach out to them personally, and there's always a caveat. Oh, I don't want to be published.
Yes, of course.
Yeah, you get what I mean. I don't want my name anywhere.
And,
you get what I mean?
and it's strange because it's not like there aren't queer asatizas or ustads. Like, there are queer ustads and asatizas. They're just, they're just not able to do that freely. So
Yeah. But I think the need for it is being seen among the religious community. It's a very slow progress, but and it would take time. And I think the point of this is, as much as however long it would take, at least the needle is moving. At least something is is mobile. You get what I mean? Not static. And we will wait. But I mean, as a historian yourself, you could see that conservatism comes and go.
Yeah.
Humanity tends to venture towards a certain direction, towards more justice, more equality, more fairness. You get what I mean?
Yeah.
And lack of equality is just a temporary phase until like something momentous occur. Yeah.
The
So
arc
we're
of the
hoping
universe is long, but it
But
tends
Exactly.
towards justice.
Exactly. Yeah. So we are hoping for that. Yeah.
Okay, so we're out of time. But last question for people listening: if they want to reach out to you, if they want to get involved, how should they find you?
So you can find us on Kwasa on Instagram and Twitter, Kwasa SG, and we've already started putting out queer spirituality surveys. We are looking at collecting more data to build our like resources in our library, but we also will begin those chapters very soon. So stay tuned, and then we will contact you through the forms and form responses if you're interested.
Okay, fantastic. All right. So thank you very much, Irie and Mohammed, for coming on Political Agenda today.
Thank you.
Really appreciate it. I wish you all the best. We'll have all those links for your stuff in the show notes. So if people want to reach out, they can reach out. And of course, thank you to you, our listener, for tuning in today. And as always, if you've enjoyed this, if you find this useful, please do join New Narrative as a member at newnarrative.com/join or donate newnarrative.com/donate. We need you to keep our movement for democracy in Southeast Asia going. Thank you very much and see you next time. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for watching. If you'd like to learn more about New Narrative, please check out this playlist up here. And if you'd like to watch episodes of Political Agenda, please check out this playlist down here. Thank you very much, and please help keep New Narrative sustainable and independent by joining as a member at newnarrative.com/join. Thank you.